Welcome to EHP, which stands for Economic History Podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Today, we are plunging straight into an economic phenomenon that the defining textbooks of the mid-20th century explicitly promised us could never exist.
Right, the ultimate macroeconomic anomaly.
Exactly. We are hunting a monster today, one that entirely broke the prevailing academic models of the post-war era, ended political careers by the dozen, and forced a total rewrite of how governments are allowed to think about money, employment, and, frankly, the price of your groceries.
And I mean, the reason we are tearing through this specific material today is because this monster has suddenly become the most urgent, unavoidable question for the second half of the 2020s.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of source material to get through for this deep dive.
We really do. We're looking at everything from ancient Roman papyrus records detailing the price of Egyptian wheat to secret tape recordings from the Nixon White House.
Those tapes are wild, by the way.
They are unbelievable. And we're bringing it all the way up to a pivotal Dallas Federal Reserve paper published in February 2026, and some very recent, very formal warnings from the OECD.
So our mission today is to dissect what stagflation actually is, the hidden mechanics of how it takes root, and, well, whether the economic storm clouds gathering right now are signaling a modern relapse.
Which is what everyone is worried about.
Right. But I want to frame the stakes for you, the listener, before we get into the historical mechanics, because it is very easy for economic history to sound like, abstract ivory tower theory.
Oh, absolutely.
But this is the opposite of abstract. This is the ultimate foundational wallet issue.
Yeah, understanding the anatomy of stagflation is literally the difference between protecting your family's purchasing power and just being completely blindsided.
Because when this specific economic condition hits, it brings this devastating two-pronged attack. You get a stagnant, freezing job market paired with exploding runaway prices.
Right. It attacks your ability to earn an income and the value of your accumulated savings at the exact same time. There's no natural safe harbor.
So to really grasp the mechanics, we should probably start by deconstructing the monster itself. I mean, the word stagflation is a portmanteau, right?
Yeah, it combines stagnation and inflation. So stagnation means that the broader economic engine has effectively seized up. Growth stops.
Businesses stop expanding.
Exactly. Hiring freezes take hold, unemployment begins to climb steadily, and overall output falls. You essentially have a society that is fundamentally producing less real wealth.
And then you have the other half.
Right, inflation, which means the prices for the goods and services that are actually available are rising relentlessly. The cost of living surges while the currency in your bank account rapidly loses its purchasing power.
Which, again, is the part that would have gotten you laughed out of a university lecture hall in 1960.
Oh, without a doubt.
Like, if I went back in time and told the brightest economic minds of the Kennedy administration that we were going to experience high unemployment and high inflation at the exact same time, they would have looked at me like I was describing a square circle.
Because they believed those two economic forces were mutually exclusive polar opposites. I mean, 50 years of established economic theory dictated that a nation could suffer from one ailment or the other, but fundamentally could not contract both simultaneously.
The models were just absolutely rigid on this point.
They were, and what's fascinating is that the term itself wasn't even born in an academic paper. It was coined in a moment of pure political frustration.
Oh yeah, Ian MacLeod, right?
Yes, a British conservative politician.
Yep.
He was giving a speech in the House of Commons in 1965, desperately trying to describe this bizarre economic trouble hitting Britain.
Right, and he tells Parliament, quote, "We now have the worst of both worlds, not just inflation on the one side or stagnation on the other, but both of them together. We have a sort of stagflation situation."
Exactly. He just tossed it out as a descriptive phrase. He had absolutely no idea he was naming the defining global crisis of the next 20 years.
I mean, the intellectual shock of that moment cannot be overstated. Economists found MacLeod's observation deeply disturbing.
Because it violated their sacred text. It violated the gospel of the Phillips curve.
Okay, we need to break that down. To understand why the entire profession was caught off guard, we have to look at the work of A.W. Phillips.
Right. So in 1958, this economist at the London School of Economics publishes a monumental study. He had spent years meticulously tracking 60 years of empirical data regarding unemployment and wage inflation within the British economy.
And what did he find?
His findings showed a beautifully stable, totally reliable inverse relationship between the two metrics.
Let me put this in a visual context for the listener, because the Phillips curve essentially became the ultimate dashboard for government policy for a decade. Picture a heavy wooden seesaw on a playground.
I love this analogy.
Thanks. So on one seat, you have unemployment. On the other seat, you have inflation. Phillips looked at 60 years of history and concluded that if you push the unemployment side down to the ground, meaning almost everyone has a job, the inflation side goes way up into the air.
Right. You physically cannot have both ends of the seesaw up in the air at once.
And the underlying logic made perfect intuitive sense, didn't it?
It did. Think about it. In a booming economy where unemployment is pushed near zero, labor becomes incredibly scarce. Workers suddenly wield immense bargaining power.
Right, because if a factory owner needs to hit production quotas, they have to offer aggressive wage hikes to attract or retain staff.
Exactly. And to protect their profit margins from those new payroll costs, the factory owner immediately passes the expense on to the consumer by raising the price of their goods. That generates inflation.
And the flip side of the seesaw.
If the economy slumps and unemployment skyrockets, terrified workers will accept wage freezes just to keep their jobs. Consumer demand plummets because people are broke.
So companies can't possibly raise prices without losing their remaining customers.
Right. Inflation dies. It's an elegant, self-contained mechanical system.
And by the early 1960s, American titans of economics like Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow took Phillips' British data and applied it to the post-war United States economy.
Right. And they mapped it out, found the exact same seesaw dynamic, but then they made a massive philosophical leap.
Yeah, they didn't just present the Phillips curve as a historical observation. They presented it to politicians as a menu.
Yes. They essentially handed the federal government a steering wheel for the macroeconomy. The proposition was intoxicating for policymakers.
Like, here are your choices, order whatever you want.
Exactly. The economists told them, look, if you want to engineer low inflation, you simply have to tolerate a slightly higher rate of unemployment. But if your political base demands full employment, no problem, you just dial up government spending and accept a mathematically predictable increase in inflation.
They truly believed that through the dark arts of Keynesian fiscal and monetary policy, a government could dial in the precise societal outcome it desired.
They honestly thought they had solved the business cycle forever.
And if we look at our historical baseline, the year 1964, they look like absolute geniuses.
They really did. Inflation in the United States was purring along at a microscopic 1%, while unemployment was sitting at a very healthy 5%.
Right, so the central bankers and the Treasury officials felt like masters of the universe.
But then the universe fought back. The government attempted to push unemployment even lower through highly expansionary spending and loose money. But instead of sliding smoothly along the Phillips curve, the seesaw defied the laws of macroeconomic gravity.
Both ends went up. Both unemployment and inflation began rising simultaneously. The entire mechanical framework shattered.
It completely broke down.
So I want to dig into the why here. How did the smartest people in the room, armed with 60 years of data, get completely blindsided by reality?
The answer lies in the human element, which the models completely ignored.
So we have to look at the groundbreaking work of Milton Friedman in 1967 and Edmund Phelps in 1968.
Right. They independently realized the Phillips curve was an illusion. It only appeared historically stable because it relied on a hidden, completely unquantified variable.
And that variable was the psychology of human expectations.
Exactly. The fatal flaw in the 1960s consensus was assuming that workers and businesses were essentially mindless cogs reacting only to the immediate present.
Okay, let's act out this psychological mechanism because this is the core of the wage price spiral. Let's say I'm an average worker in 1964. Inflation has been practically zero for a decade.
Right, you're used to stable prices.
Yeah, so when I walk into my boss's office for my annual review, I negotiate my salary based on the assumption that a gallon of milk is going to cost the exact same next year as it does today. If my boss gives me a 3% raise, I feel like I'm getting ahead.
But what happens to your brain if the government starts printing money and you spend 3 years watching the price of milk, rent, and gas jump higher every single month?
My entire behavioral framework shifts. By the time my next annual review rolls around, I'm not negotiating based on the past anymore. I am preemptively defending myself against the future.
Precisely. You walk into that office and demand a 10% raise, not because your productivity increased, but because you mathematically need 10% just to survive the inflation you now expect to happen over the next 12 months.
My boss, who is also experiencing this exact same psychological shift, knows I'll quit if he says no. So he grants the 10% raise to his entire staff.
But to afford that massive new payroll, he immediately hikes the price of your company's products by 10%.
which hits the broader market, raising the cost of living for everyone else, and proving to me that I was an absolute genius for demanding that raise in the first place.
Exactly. You validated your own fear. That is the vicious, self-sustaining loop of the wage price spiral.
So once inflation expectations become anchored in the psychology of the public, the inflation feeds entirely on itself.
Right. It detaches completely from the unemployment rate. It doesn't matter if the labor market is tight or loose. Even if unemployment spikes and the economy slows down, workers will still demand massive raises to cover the rising cost of living.
And businesses will still hike prices to cover those wages.
Yes. Friedman actually won a Nobel Prize in 1976, largely for predicting that if governments kept trying to game the Phillips curve, they would merely embed inflation expectations and end up with the worst of both worlds.
It's a brilliant theoretical epiphany. But, theories only become history when politicians force them into reality.
That's true.
And the political environment of the 1960s was essentially a laboratory designed to accidentally construct a massive monetary bomb. We have to examine Lyndon B. Johnson and the impossible world historic dilemma he faced.
Yeah, Johnson inherited an agonizing geopolitical and domestic landscape. By the mid-1960s, he was determined to execute two staggeringly expensive initiatives simultaneously.
The classic guns and butter.
Exactly. First, the rapid, massive military escalation of the Vietnam War, the guns. Second, his sweeping domestic agenda known as the Great Society of the Butter,
which included the unprecedented creation of Medicare and Medicaid, vast urban renewal programs, and sweeping civil rights implementations.
was incredibly ambitious.
But if LBJ had consulted an honest accountant, they would have told him that funding a major overseas war and fundamentally restructuring the American social safety net at the exact same time required a massive, immediate tax increase on the American public.
Right, to drain excess capital out of the private economy and transfer to the state.
But Johnson was a master of the Senate and a ruthless political calculator. He knew that forcing middle-class Americans to pay higher taxes to fund a highly controversial war while simultaneously funding domestic welfare programs would be an act of political suicide.
So he simply refused to raise taxes to cover the true cost of his ambitions. He chose to have both the guns and the butter.
And so the Treasury issues a mountain of government debt to pay the bills. And this is where the central bank gets compromised.
Yes. The Federal Reserve, under intense back-channel political pressure, accommodates all of this deficit spending. They keep interest rates artificially low and effectively print the money the Treasury needs to keep the government checks clearing.
Which triggers a textbook case of demand-pull inflation.
Let's break down the mechanics of demand-pull inflation, because it is the most foundational form of price instability.
Go lay it out.
The government is creating billions of new dollars out of thin air and injecting them directly into the economy. They're paying defense contractors, funding hospitals, writing checks to construction firms. Suddenly, the public has vastly more money in their pockets and they rush out to buy things.
But the physical industrial base of the United States, the actual factories, supply chains, and raw materials, cannot magically produce goods as fast as the government is producing money.
Exactly. You have too much money chasing too few goods.
So the sellers look out the window, see a mob of people waving cash for a limited number of refrigerators and cars, and they simply raise the price.
And we can track this exact monetary creep in the historical data. Remember our 1964 guideline of 1% inflation.
Right.
By 1968, as the Vietnam and Great Society spending hits terminal velocity, inflation has crept up to nearly 5%. The water is starting to boil.
And the man tasked with watching the thermometer was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, William McChesney Martin. He understood exactly what was unfolding.
He really did. Martin is actually the author of the most enduring metaphor in central banking history. He famously declared that the fundamental job of the Federal Reserve is, quote, to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going.
I love that quote. By that, he meant the Fed must aggressively raise interest rates and restrict the money supply to cool down an overheating economy before inflation escapes containment.
Even if it makes the central bank deeply unpopular.
Right. But the historical reality of what happened to Martin is far more physical and brutal than a cocktail party analogy.
Oh, the stories are incredible.
Yeah, the historical accounts of his relationship with President Johnson are just staggering. LBJ summoned Martin down to his ranch in Texas. Now, Johnson was an incredibly large, physically imposing, and notoriously intimidating man.
Very much so.
And according to the accounts, LBJ literally cornered the chairman of the Federal Reserve, grabbed him by the lapels, shoved him physically against a wall, and berated him.
He demanded that Martin keep the money spigots open and interest rates low so the economic boom wouldn't collapse before the next election cycle.
I mean, confronted with the sheer raw exercise of presidential power, Martin compromised.
He didn't take the punch bowl away, he left it sitting on the table, and the Monetary Party raged on, feeding the exact inflation psychology that Friedman had warned about.
Which brings a new administration into power. Richard Nixon takes the Oval Office in 1969.
And Nixon inherits a dangerously overheating economy, but he also brings his own deep psychological baggage into the West Wing.
Right. Nixon was absolutely haunted by his razor-thin loss to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election.
Because in Nixon's mind, that loss was entirely the fault of the Eisenhower administration for allowing a very mild economic recession to occur during the campaign season.
Yeah, Nixon essentially made a blood oath to himself that he would never, ever allow economic austerity to cost to another election.
And that intense paranoia fueled what remains the most destructive, toxic relationship between a sitting president and a Federal Reserve chairman in the history of the United States.
So in 1970, Nixon appointed Arthur Burns to lead the Fed. Now, Burns was a highly credentialed, respected academic economist.
But Nixon viewed him purely as an instrument of political leverage. And we don't have to guess about the nature of their relationship because Nixon installed a secret audio taping system that recorded their conversations.
The October 1971 tapes are just staggering to listen to. You have the President of the United States sitting across from the man theoretically in charge of maintaining the stability of the U.S. dollar.
Right. And Nixon looks at Burns and says verbatim, "I've never seen anybody beaten on inflation in the United States. I've seen many people beaten on unemployment."
The directive was crystal clear. Nixon was telling his central banker, I do not care about the stability of the currency. I do not care what things cost at the grocery store. Print the money, slash interest rates, flood the zone with capital, and ensure the job market is burning red hot when voters go to the polls in 1972.
And Arthur Burns completely capitulates.
He just caves.
He slashes the federal funds rate from a restrictive 5% all the way down to an expansionary 3.5% in 1971. He was pouring gasoline onto an economy that was already fighting 5% inflation.
But I think we need to pause here and examine the human reality of this moment. It is incredibly easy for us to sit here decades later reading the data and cast Arthur Burns as a villain.
Sure.
But put yourself in that room. The President of the United States, a commander-in-chief, a man renowned for destroying his political enemies, is effectively threatening your legacy and demanding you stimulate the economy. Is it genuinely possible for a bureaucrat, even a powerful one, to look the president in the eye and say no?
It requires a rare, almost pathological level of institutional courage, which Burns clearly lacked. But the true tragedy of Arthur Burns isn't just that he followed politically motivated orders.
What was it?
Is how he intellectually rationalized his surrender. Burns couldn't admit to himself or the public that the Fed was intentionally debasing the currency to re-elect Richard Nixon. So he constructed a deeply flawed economic narrative to justify his actions.
He began publicly blaming external non-monetary forces for the rising prices.
Exactly. He gave speeches pointing the finger at greedy labor unions demanding too much pay, chaotic weather patterns driving up food costs, and corporate executives engaging in price gouging.
So he essentially argued that because the inflation was being caused by all these bad actors in the real economy, raising interest rates wouldn't solve the problem anyway.
Right. He told himself a fairy tale where he was the noble defender of the working class, keeping employment high, while entirely ignoring the fact that his own printing press was the root cause of the currency's devaluation.
And while Burns was busy deflecting blame, Nixon realized that the inflation data was still climbing too fast for comfort ahead of the 1972 election. So Nixon went for the absolute nuclear option of economic policy.
August 1971.
Yes, he signed an executive order instituting a 90-day freeze on all wages and all prices across the entirety of the United States economy.
It is a staggering assertion of state power. I mean, nothing of this magnitude had been attempted in America outside of the total mobilization and rationing of World War II.
Think about the logistics for a second. Every single price tag in every single grocery store, hardware store, and car dealership in the country was frozen by federal decree. Every worker's hourly wage was legally locked.
And the most terrifying part for economists watching this unfold was that, in the short term, it appeared to work brilliantly.
The public loved it. I mean, inflation vanished overnight because it was literally illegal to raise prices. The economy felt fantastic, employment stayed high, and Richard Nixon cruised to a historic, overwhelming landslide re-election in 1972.
But Milton Friedman, observing this massive intervention, saw the catastrophe looming. He reportedly remarked that price controls can certainly suppress inflation long enough to win an election, but they cure nothing.
Because he knew that after the controls were lifted, the country would face a violent upsurge in inflation.
Right. Friedman understood the fundamental mechanics of price controls. They do not eliminate the underlying inflation, they merely mask it. If you continually pump excess money into an economy while legally capping prices, you are essentially holding an inflatable beach ball underwater.
The pressure is building every second.
Exactly.
And the moment of rupture arrives in November 1973. Nixon, having safely secured his second term, lifts the price controls, and the suppressed inflation detonates.
The beach ball explodes out of the water.
Businesses that had been bleeding money due to frozen prices instantly hike their rates to catch up. But this monetary explosion coincides precisely with a geopolitical earthquake, creating a perfect storm.
Yeah, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupts. Egyptian and Syrian forces launch a coordinated surprise attack on Israel.
And the United States government steps in to provide massive military and logistical backing to the Israelis.
Right, and in direct retaliation, the Arab member states of OPEC weaponize their natural resources. They impose a total oil embargo on the United States and its allies.
Now, you listening right now, we have covered the complex geopolitical machinations of the OPEC embargo in other analyses. For this thump dive, we must focus exclusively on the raw macroeconomic physics of what an oil shock does to a system already primed with monetary excess.
Because this is the exogenous shock that officially breaks the back of the American economy. Between October 1973 and the early months of 1974, the global price of oil quadrupled.
Quadrupled in a matter of months.
Yes, and we must carefully delineate why a sudden spike in oil prices is uniquely destructive compared to a spike in, say, copper or lumber. Oil is not merely a commodity, it is the foundational input cost upon which the entire architecture of a modern industrialized economy is built.
It's literally in the DNA of everything we consume.
Precisely. When the price of crude oil quadruples overnight, it sends a synchronized, devastating cost wave through every single sector.
The diesel fuel required for the trucking fleets that deliver food to supermarkets goes up.
The electricity required to keep the lights on in manufacturing plants goes up.
The petroleum-based plastics used to package consumer goods go up.
The aviation fuel for cargo planes goes up. Every single business, regardless of industry, faces a massive simultaneous spike in their baseline operating costs.
Let's walk through the actual business logic of this supply-side shock. Suppose I own a medium-sized manufacturing facility making kitchen appliances. My monthly energy and shipping costs have just gone up 400%. What is my immediate reaction to survive?
You are forced into making two incredibly painful decisions simultaneously. First, your profit margins have been completely obliterated by your new energy bill, so you must immediately pass those costs onto your customers by drastically raising the retail price of your appliances. Second, because your production costs are so exorbitant and consumer demand is dropping because everything is so expensive, you can no longer afford to manufacture at your previous volume. So you cut your production targets, you power down half your assembly lines, and you lay off a massive percentage of your workforce.
So the mechanics of a supply shock dictate that I am legally forced to hike my prices and fire my workers at the exact same moment just to avoid bankruptcy.
That is the exact mechanism. This is entirely different from the demand pull inflation of the late 60s, where prices rose because consumers had too much cash.
This is a violent, sudden contraction of the economy's actual physical capacity to generate goods. The supply chain itself is seizing up.
This is the moment the Phillips curve seesaw officially shatters. You have prices rocketing upward at the exact same time the unemployment lines are stretching around the block.
And the macroeconomic carnage that hit the United States was historically unprecedented. Real GDP declined for 6 consecutive quarters, a sustained contraction the country hadn't witnessed since the depths of the Great Depression.
It was incredibly grim.
Unemployment surged, hitting 9% by May 1975, which equated to roughly 6 million Americans losing their livelihoods. And simultaneously, inflation breached double digits, hitting a terrifying 12.3% in 1974.
Even Arthur Burns, who had spent years spinning elaborate theories to deny the reality of monetary excess, was forced to confront the wreckage.
Right. Years later, while delivering an address in Belgrade, He offered a staggering confession that haunts macroeconomic textbooks to this day.
He admitted, quote, "The rules economics are not working in quite the way they used to."
It was the ultimate institutional capitulation.
It really was. And to quantify this dual nightmare for the average citizen, economists popularized a new, brutally simple metric called the misery index.
Which is just the official unemployment rate added to the official inflation rate, right?
Exactly. And let's look at the trajectory. Back in our golden baseline year of 1964, the misery index stood at a very manageable 6. By 1980, as the stagflation crisis peaked, the misery index had skyrocketed to 22.
But the data points on a chart don't capture the grinding reality. We have to examine the lived experience of the 1970s. This wasn't a theoretical malaise. It was a visceral, daily panic.
The sheer physical disruption was unbelievable.
Here, talking about literal miles of cars idling in gas lines, snaking around city blocks, with drivers waiting 3 or 4 hours just for the chance to reach a pump before the station ran dry.
And the panic was so severe, the government had to implement odd-even rationing based on your license plate.
Right. If your plate ended in an odd number, you were only legally permitted to buy gasoline on odd-numbered days of the month.
And then you had the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, sitting in the Oval Office wearing a thick cardigan sweater, delivering a national television address, pleading with American families to turn down their home thermostats, put on more clothes, and psychologically accept a permanently lowered standard of living.
The micro-anecdotes from our sources perfectly illustrate how deeply the economy seized up. There is a verified account of a car dealership in the Midwest that placed a massive sign in its front window announcing they were closing their doors.
Why?
Because they simply could not afford the interest rates required to borrow the money to buy new inventory from the manufacturer.
Wow.
And you had commercial airline flights carrying passengers that were literally diverted midair because the airlines suddenly realized they couldn't afford the surging fuel costs required to complete the originally scheduled routes.
The circulatory system of American commerce was failing.
As apocalyptic and uniquely modern as this felt to Americans living through the 1970s, well, here is where the history gets deeply unsettling. This was not a modern invention.
No, it wasn't.
To find the precise blueprint for this exact chain of disasters, a government spending vastly beyond its means, manipulating the currency, publicly blaming greedy merchants, instituting draconian price controls, and watching a sophisticated society regress, you have to rewind the clock about 1,700 years.
Yeah, the direct historical predecessor to the stagflation of the 1970s is the Roman Empire during the prolonged catastrophe known as the crisis of the 3rd century.
And the economic parallels are so exact they are genuinely unnerving. Let's set the stage. We are looking at the Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD.
Right, and they are facing immense sustained military pressure on their borders.
Germanic tribal confederations are probing the northern frontiers, while the highly organized Persian Sassanid Empire is launching massive incursions in the east.
And the Roman military apparatus is the most expensive institution in the ancient world, and the emperors suddenly need vastly more soldiers, more armor, more fortifications, and more supply lines.
So they face the exact same political dilemma that Lyndon Johnson faced with the Vietnam War.
Exactly. Raising taxes on the Roman populace high enough to genuinely fund this massive military mobilization would almost certainly trigger a sprawling provincial revolt.
Or, more likely given the volatile politics of the era, the immediate assassination of the emperor by his own Praetorian Guard.
Right. They needed incredible amounts of money, but they couldn't tax the citizenry to get it. So they turned to the ancient world's version of the Federal Reserve's printing press, the imperial mint.
But wait, we need to explain the physical mechanics of this. In 1968, the Fed can just print paper dollars or change numbers on a ledger. How does an ancient emperor magically expand the money supply when the currency is made of physical, finite chunks of silver?
They execute a process called currency debasement, and the mechanics are really insidious. The imperial treasury would collect the existing high-quality silver coins, the denarius, through standard taxation. They would take those coins to the mint, melt them down in massive crucibles, and then reissue the money. But during the melting process, the mint masters would intentionally mix in massive amounts of cheap base metals, primarily copper and bronze.
So they're watering down the money.
Exactly. The newly struck coin looked largely identical to the old one. It featured the current emperor's profile, and the state decreed it held the exact same legal face value of 1 denarius.
But its intrinsic value, the actual precious metal inside it, was drastically reduced.
Right. By diluting the silver, the emperor could strike 3, 4, or 5 coins out of the silver that previously only yielded 1. They massively expanded the circulating money supply without having to conquer new territory or discover new silver mines.
The statistics tracking this debasement are breathtaking. Our sources have mapped the metallurgical breakdown of the denarius over time.
And it is a steep drop.
Under Emperor Augustus, at the dawn of the empire, the denarius was roughly 95% pure silver. It was a globally trusted store of value.
But by the reign of Nero, as he rebuilt Rome and funded wars, purity dropped to 85%.
Under Marcus Aurelius battling the Germanic tribes, it slipped to 75%.
Caracalla aggressively cuts it down to 50% to appease the army.
And then the floor completely falls out. By the year 268 AD, at the absolute nadir of the crisis of the 3rd century, the denarius contained a microscopic 0.5% silver.
It was essentially a worthless slug of cheap copper, coated in a micron-thin wash of silver that would literally rub off onto a citizen's thumb within a few weeks of circulating in the market.
In just a few generations, the imperial government intentionally destroyed the primary unit of exchange of the most sophisticated economy on Earth.
And mirroring the 1970s oil embargo, Rome's self-inflicted monetary crisis collided with catastrophic exogenous supply shocks.
Right.
The empire was hit by a devastating pandemic known as the Plague of Cyprian, which raged for nearly 2 decades. It killed millions of citizens and completely decimated the agricultural labor force, slashing food production across the provinces.
Simultaneously, the political structure collapsed into violent chaos. Over a 50-year span, there were at least 26 different claims to the imperial throne.
And this era of endless, grinding civil wars completely shattered the intricate, safe trade routes that the Roman economy relied upon. Merchant ships were seized, roads were infested with bandits, and regional supply chains simply dissolved.
So you have a toxic macroeconomic cocktail. Millions of debased, practically worthless copper coins are multiplying in everyone's pockets, artificially inflating demand.
But the actual physical availability of goods, wheat, olive oil, timber, has plummeted due to mass death and endless war.
Too much fake money chasing a rapidly shrinking pool of real goods.
The result was an era of apocalyptic hyperinflation. Across the empire, prices for basic necessities rose by roughly 1,000%.
We have surviving papyrus records from Roman Egypt that meticulously track the price of staple commodities. In the early 2nd century, a standard unit of wheat in Egypt cost approximately 2 denarii.
And by 285 AD, that exact same unit of wheat cost over 200 denarii.
The economic trust evaporated so completely that the Roman legions, the very soldiers the emperors were debasing the currency to pay, realized their wages were functionally worthless.
Yeah, they threatened mutiny unless they were paid directly in physical gold bullion or actual rations of grain and salt.
The most advanced, monetized, specialized economy in human history began rapidly devolving back into a primitive barter system because the currency was dead.
And out of this total collapse emerges Emperor Diocletian. He seizes absolute power in 284 AD and launches a sweeping authoritarian restructuring of the entire imperial apparatus.
He reorganizes the military, divides the empire's administration, and completely overhauls the tax code.
But his most infamous desperate intervention occurs in 301 AD, the issuance of the Edict on Maximum Prices.
This is the ancient equivalent of Nixon's wage and price freeze, but dialed up to a level of terrifying granular authoritarianism.
Oh, absolutely.
The edict doesn't just declare broad caps on categories. It lists legally mandated maximum prices for over 1,400 highly specific goods and services.
It's incredibly detailed.
I am talking about individual price limits for first-quality sea fish versus second-quality river fish. Specific prices for different breeds of game birds, varying qualities of wool cloaks, and specific styles of leather shoes.
It set maximum daily wages for sewer cleaners, chariot drivers, legal scribes, and bakers.
And if a Roman citizen was caught buying or selling a single item above the mandated maximum price, the legal penalty was not a fine or imprisonment. The penalty was death.
What is truly fascinating for economic historians is the preamble attached to the edict. If you read Diocletian's justification, the political rhetoric is indistinguishable from Arthur Burns or Richard Nixon.
Oh, absolutely. Diocletian explicitly blames the rampant inflation on the sheer, boundless greed of merchants, speculators, and black market profiteers.
He refuses entirely to acknowledge that 50 years of imperial coin debasement, the actions of the state itself, caused the crisis.
I have to ask a psychological question here because this pattern drives me crazy. Why is it that from Emperor Diocletian in 301 AD all the way to Richard Nixon in the 1970s, the immediate absolute knee-jerk instinct of a politician is to point the finger at the local merchant selling the bread or the gas, rather than looking inward at the actions of their own treasury or central bank?
Well, because the alternative requires the politician to accept complete accountability for the suffering of the populace.
Right.
Acknowledging that systemic inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon caused by the state means admitting that the only cure is for the state to undergo severe austerity.
The government would have to drastically slash its spending programs or aggressively raise taxes to pull money out of the system.
Both of those actions anger the voting public or the military and directly threaten the leader's grip on power. Blaming a greedy, faceless merchant class provides the public with a tangible enemy to direct their rage toward.
And it conveniently casts the politician in the role of the heroic protector, intervening with heavy-handed laws to save the common man.
Exactly.
So with the literal threat of state-sanctioned execution hanging over every marketplace in the empire, did Diocletian's edict work? Did the threat of death stabilize the Roman economy?
It failed comprehensively, disastrously, and almost immediately. You simply cannot cure an inflation crisis by capping prices by decree if you leave the underlying monetary disease untreated.
Because merchants looked at the edict and realized that trading their highly valuable, scarce wheat or oil for worthless, debased copper coins at the government's mandated price would bankrupt them.
So they chose survival over obedience. They hoarded their goods in secret warehouses. When they did sell, they operated exclusively on massive, sprawling black markets demanding payment in pure gold, silver bullion, or direct barter.
Which means the official legal marketplaces of the Roman Empire were totally, physically empty. The citizens and soldiers Diocletian was ostensibly trying to protect couldn't find a single loaf of bread to buy at the legal price.
The edict was universally ignored and effectively dead within 4 years of its issuance. The crucial enduring lesson here, echoing across 17 centuries of human history, is that price controls are a futile attempt to outlaw basic human nature and the laws of supply and demand.
They cannot, under any circumstances, fix a currency that has been destroyed from within. Rome couldn't legislate its way out of the trap, and America in the mid-1970s couldn't either. The Nixon and Ford administrations only managed to mask the underlying rot by plunging the economy into a deeply painful recession, but they never fundamentally cured the inflation psychology.
Which brings us to the dawn of the 1980s.
The moment of maximum economic pain and the arrival of the man who was finally willing to administer the lethal dose of medicine required to kill the monster.
By 1979, the United States was facing a terrifying relapse. The Iranian Revolution violently toppled the Shah, causing Iranian oil production to collapse overnight.
This triggered a second, massive oil shock that swept across the global economy.
Inflation, which had slightly moderated, roared right back, breaching 11%. President Jimmy Carter's administration is essentially in political freefall. The misery index is shattering all-time highs, and the dollar is plunging in value globally.
In an act of pure, desperate political survival, Carter realizes he needs a totally different kind of central banker. He appoints Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Paul Volcker is one of the most fascinating figures in 20th century history. Our sources paint an incredibly vivid picture of his persona.
He was the absolute polar opposite of Arthur Burns.
Volcker stood 6'7", possessed a booming voice, constantly smoked cheap cigars regardless of who was in the room, and most importantly, he was entirely pathologically immune to political flattery or pressure. He did not care about election cycles.
Volcker understood precisely what was at stake for the survival of the American financial system. He had spent his career watching from the sidelines as Burns folded to Nixon, and he had spent the 1970s watching the devastating, compounding consequences of that cowardice rot the economy.
He knew that incremental rate hikes wouldn't work anymore. The public's inflation expectations were too deeply entrenched. He believed the only way to kill stagflation was a brutal, deliberate, highly visible act of economic shock therapy.
And he delivers that shock on October 6, 1979. He convenes a highly unusual secretive weekend meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee and fundamentally rewrites the operational playbook of the central bank.
He implements the core tenets of Milton Friedman's monetarist doctrine.
We need to explain the technical shift here because it is Profound.
Right. Historically, the Federal Reserve attempted to manage the economy by subjectively picking a target interest rate, the federal funds rate, and moving it up or down by small increments.
But picking that rate always involves a political judgment call about how much pain the economy can handle.
Volcker threw that entire system out the window. He announced that the Fed was no longer going to target interest rates at all. Instead, they were going to directly target and restrict the actual physical supply of money circulating in the economy.
They would choke off the oxygen.
And they would allow interest rates to float upward to whatever astronomically high, politically toxic number the free market dictated was necessary to achieve that restriction.
And the phrase astronomically high doesn't even begin to capture the violence of the spike. The pain he unleashed on the American borrowing class was staggering.
The federal funds rate, the baseline rate banks charge each other, hit an unbelievable 20% by June 1981.
The prime lending rate, which is the absolute best rate banks offer to their most secure corporate clients, hit 21.5%.
Imagine you're running a successful mid-sized paper company in 1980. You just need a standard short-term loan to make payroll or upgrade a machine, and your local bank tells you the interest is 21%.
It freezes commerce instantly. But for the average listener, the most visceral, shocking number is the housing market. Standard 30-year fixed mortgage rates peaked at an astonishing 17%.
It is almost impossible for a modern consumer to fathom those numbers. A mortgage at 17% meant that the fundamental pillar of the American dream, homeownership, instantly became mathematically unaffordable for millions of working-class and middle-class families.
The monthly payments were simply impossible to carry.
The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. The housing construction market collapsed entirely.
The American auto industry, which was already hemorrhaging market share to smaller, fuel-efficient Japanese imports, went into absolute freefall because consumers couldn't afford 20% auto loans.
The geographic region we now call the Rust Belt of the American Midwest was effectively forged in the fire of Volcker's policies.
Thousands of heavy manufacturing plants that had borrowed heavily during the 70s to expand simply couldn't service their debt at 21% interest. They locked their gates and declared bankruptcy.
By December 1982, the national unemployment rate reached a devastating 10.8%. In that single year, 69,000 American businesses went bankrupt.
The political and societal outrage directed at the Federal Reserve was unlike anything the institution had ever faced in its history.
It was visceral, physical fury.
The sources detail incredible scenes of protest. Desperate farmers, completely unable to afford the exorbitant loans required to buy tractors or seed, drove thousands of tractors into Washington, D.C., and physically blockaded the entrance to the Federal Reserve building.
Home builders, furious that their entire industry had been deliberately suffocated, began mailing Paul Volcker the physical brass keys to their unsold houses.
And mailing him chunks of 2x4 lumber as a tactile protest of their ruined livelihoods. He was receiving daily death threats.
But this is the exact moment where Volcker's personal character fundamentally altered the trajectory of global economic history.
There's an incredible historical anecdote in our sources that perfectly captures his iron will. Volcker agrees to leave the safety of Washington and go speak in person to a national convention of the National Association of Home Builders.
These are the very men and women whose businesses, savings, and careers he is systematically destroying.
He walks onto the stage, all 6'7" of him, puffs his cheap cigar, looks out at this incredibly hostile crowd, and tells them the blunt, unvarnished truth.
He says, in effect, I know exactly how much agony my policies are causing you. But if I back down now, if I lower rates to give you temporary relief, inflation will roar back.
And all the bankruptcies, all the pain you have suffered over the last 2 years will have been for absolutely nothing. We have to finish the job, or the next time we try to kill this monster, the reckoning will destroy the country.
And the astonishing thing, when he finished speaking, those angry, bankrupt home builders rose to their feet and gave him a standing ovation.
It is a profound testament to the power of truth and leadership. They absolutely hated the brutal medicine, but they recognized the unimpeachable integrity of the doctor. They knew deep in their bones that he was telling them the agonizing macroeconomic truth.
They did.
I do want to push back on the sheer brutality of his methods, though. I look at the devastation, 69,000 bankruptcies, millions of lost jobs, the decimation of the American manufacturing base, the highest unemployment since the 1930s. Was it truly unequivocally necessary to inflict that level of catastrophic trauma on the working class, just so the central bank could regain its theoretical credibility? Could there not have been a softer landing?
The consensus verdict of economic history is a resounding, unavoidable yes, because we must look at the ultimate result of that trauma. Inflation, which had peaked near 15% and threatened to destabilize the entire republic, was fundamentally, permanently broken.
By 1983, it had plummeted to 3.7%.
And crucially, because Volcker proved through his actions that the Federal Reserve would prioritize price stability over political popularity and over short-term employment, the psychology of the American public finally shifted.
Inflation expectations reset. Workers stopped demanding preemptive 10% raises because they believed Volcker would keep prices stable.
This reset ushered in a historic 4-decade era of economic stability known as the Great Moderation. The stock and bond markets, realizing the underlying currency was finally sound again, began a historic multi-generational rally.
The cure was unimaginably brutal, but it worked precisely and only because Volcker refused to stop the chemotherapy halfway through the treatment.
Paul Volcker proved that the stagflation monster is not invincible, it can be slaughtered.
But his victory came with a terrifying caveat. It can only be beaten if our institutions possess an iron will, total independence, and an absolute immunity to political pressure.
And that reality pivots us to the most uncomfortable, urgent part of this deep dive.
We had to close the history books on the 1980s and turn our attention to the flashing red data on the dashboard right now in the second half of the 2020s.
This is where a careful, objective reading of the historical pattern begins to produce a picture that serious macroeconomic analysts are watching with intense, mounting anxiety. We must dissect the modern parallels based on the economic realities of early 2026.
Let's start by unpacking a highly influential paper published by the Dallas Federal Reserve in February 2026. This paper fundamentally challenges the popular historical narrative we just walked through, and it serves as the warning bell for our current decade.
The Dallas Fed paper posits a crucial reevaluation of the 1970s. The popular myth is that the Arab oil embargo single-handedly caused stagflation. The researchers argue that this is entirely backwards.
What do they claim instead?
Their thesis proves that the core inflation was overwhelmingly generated by the massive, sustained monetary excess of the 1960s and early 70s, the guns and butter deficit spending, and the Fed's accommodation of it.
That flood of money is what systematically unmoored consumer inflation expectations.
The 1973 oil shock was merely a massive accelerant poured onto a fire that the government had already painstakingly built.
Which provides the terrifying setup for our modern economy. Because if we map Lyndon Johnson's massive guns and butter deficit spending onto the timeline of the modern era, what is our equivalent?
It is the unprecedented global response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Over a 2-year period, we witnessed the creation of trillions of dollars in direct stimulus checks mailed to citizens. We saw the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. Let me explain PPP for a moment, because it is historically wild.
It really is.
The government essentially printed billions of dollars and gave it to businesses to replace the revenue they lost during lockdowns, and then completely forgave the loans, permanently injecting that new cash into the private wealth pool. We had massively enhanced unemployment benefits.
And while the Treasury was borrowing trillions to fund this, the Federal Reserve held interest rates at absolute zero and engaged in unprecedented bond-buying programs to flood the banking sector with liquidity.
We built a monetary bonfire that dwarfs the 1960s.
And precisely as that historic tsunami of excess money supply was working its way through the arteries of the global economy, we were hit with our modern equivalent of the Yom Kippur War's exogenous shock.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent fracturing of the European energy markets.
The 2022 energy crisis shares the exact same macroeconomic DNA as the 1973 OPEC embargo. It was a massive, sudden, violent supply-side disruption to the fundamental energy inputs of the global economy.
And crucially, it arrived at the exact historical moment when the global economy was saturated with excess pandemic-era money. It was the match hitting the tinderbox.
But the energy shock alone didn't break us. The real kicker, the specific catalyst that has the markets panicking right now in early 2026, is the weaponization of trade policy. We have to talk about the tariffs.
This requires a very cold, analytical look at the mechanics of international trade. Tariffs are often discussed as political tools, but in their purest macroeconomic form, they are aggressive supply-side shocks.
If the United States government imposes a sweeping 25% tariff on imported steel, they have instantly, by decree, raise the fundamental input cost for every single domestic manufacturer that relies on steel, from automakers to construction firms to appliance builders.
And what happened in 2025? The United States implemented some of the highest, most sweeping tariff rates seen in over a century.
We are talking about tariff walls higher than anything enacted since the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909.
The macroeconomic consequence of this policy is entirely predictable. We are forcing massive, sweeping cost increases across incredibly broad swaths of the American economy simultaneously.
The directional impact of tariffs is unambiguous and undeniable. They force domestic consumer prices higher, and they act as a heavy tax that slows down overall economic growth.
They artificially engineer the exact two foundational conditions required for stagflation to take root.
And the hard data is already flashing red. If we look at the numbers from Q4 of 2025, U.S. gross domestic product growth plummeted to a stagnant 0.7%.
Simultaneously, core inflation refused to drop. Let me define core inflation quickly. It's a metric where economists strip out the highly volatile prices of food and energy to see the true underlying trend of prices across the broader economy.
That core inflation remained stubbornly, dangerously sticky, well above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%.
The data looks so bad that the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, issued a highly unusual formal warning about a brewing global stagflationary storm.
We also must layer profound, structural, long-term shifts on top of these immediate shocks. The entire economic era of the 1990s and 2000s was defined by hyperglobalization.
Moving American manufacturing to cheap labor markets in Asia served as a massive disinflationary force, keeping the cost of consumer goods artificially low for decades.
But that era is violently reversing. Supply chains are deglobalizing. Driven by geopolitical tensions, manufacturing is being reshored back to the United States, or friend-shored to closer allies.
From a national security and supply chain resilience perspective, this makes total sense. But from a pure macroeconomic perspective, it permanently raises the baseline cost of production for everything. It acts as a structural, decades-long supply shock.
There's also a severe geopolitical risk playing out right now that mirrors the vulnerability of the 1970s. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively, aggressively pursuing de-dollarization.
In the 1970s, the weakness of the U.S. dollar on the global stage drastically amplified domestic inflation.
Today, if the global petrodollar system fractures and foreign central banks decide they no longer need to hold massive reserves of U.S. currency to trade oil, the demand for the dollar drops. The dollar weakens.
And a weak dollar means that every single good we import into the United States instantly becomes significantly more expensive, adding massive fuel to the inflation fire.
But perhaps the most alarming, historically resonant parallel of all is the political dynamic. Stephen Roach, a highly respected macroeconomist, explicitly drew this comparison in an April 2025 warning.
He pointed to the toxic combination of tariff-driven inflation, a weakening dollar, and intense public political pressure being brought to bear on the Federal Reserve.
The ghosts of Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns are back in the room.
We have watched Donald Trump publicly, repeatedly, and aggressively attack Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. We have seen demands for immediate interest rate cuts, regardless of what the underlying inflation data dictates, coupled with assertions that the executive branch has the right to fire the Fed chair.
Whether that is legally true is almost beside the point. The psychological impact on the global markets is undeniable.
When the executive branch publicly attacks the independence of the central bank during a fragile period of sticky inflation and global supply shocks, you are looking directly at the specter of 1971.
Now, to maintain absolute analytical objectivity, we must forcefully balance the scales. The 2020s are not a perfect, symmetrical carbon copy of the 1970s. There are significant structural reassurances. First, headline inflation today is nowhere near the terrifying 14% peak of 1980. Crucially, consumer inflation expectations remain mostly anchored. The average American worker does not yet fundamentally believe that 10% annual inflation is a permanent, structural fact of life, meaning the wage price spiral hasn't fully detonated.
Furthermore, despite the intense political noise, the Federal Reserve still nominally retains its institutional independence and has proven willing to hold rates high.
And structurally, the modern U.S. economy is far more weighted toward digital services and significantly less energy-intensive per dollar of GDP than the heavy manufacturing economy of 1973.
I completely agree. A spike in oil doesn't instantly shatter our entire industrial base the way it used to.
Yeah.
But listen, the best analogy I can construct for where we are standing right now in 2026 is this. We are standing in the middle of a dense, dry forest. Over the last few years, through massive pandemic stimulus and zero interest rates, someone has systematically stacked a massive pile of bone-dry monetary firewood all around us.
And now, geopolitical wars, energy crises, and historic tariff walls are violently tossing sparks into the air above the wood.
The fire hasn't fully caught yet, but we are just standing here watching the sparks fall, praying the forest doesn't ignite.
Which is exactly why we need to equip the listener with a specific, actionable dashboard. Understanding the history is useless unless you can use it to read the present.
If you want to protect your savings and your career, you need to know exactly what metrics will signal that the forest has caught fire. Let's build that dashboard right now. I want to break down 5 specific, trackable indicators you must monitor over the next few years. Indicator number 1, inflation expectations.
You need to watch the University of Michigan consumer sentiment surveys, and you need to watch bond market break-even rates.
Let me explain break-even rate simply. It is the difference in yield between a regular government bond and an inflation-protected government bond. It essentially tells you exactly what the multi-trillion-dollar bond market is, betting inflation will be over the next 5 to 10 years.
If those break-in rates spike, or if the Michigan surveys show consumers panicking about future prices, the psychological trap has snapped shut. The wage price spiral is beginning.
Indicator number 2, Fed independence. When you read the financial news, pay close attention to the rhetoric. Will Jerome Powell, or whoever inevitably succeeds him, fold under intense political pressure to slash rates before inflation is dead, the way Arthur Burns did?
Or will they stand firm, absorb the political hatred, and hold rates high like Paul Volcker? If you see the central bank caving to election year politics while inflation is sticky, head for the hills.
Indicator number 3, the global oil market. Keep a very close eye on geopolitical choke points, particularly the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East.
Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption flows through that narrow waterway. With Brent crude oil currently sitting above $90 a barrel in early 2026, any massive military disruption in that strait provides the exact kind of violent supply-side accelerant that blew up the global economy in 1973.
Indicator number 4, the labor market. This is the stagnation half of the monster. Stagflation inherently requires widespread job losses.
If the currently resilient labor market begins to violently crack, if we start seeing rolling waves of mass corporate layoffs while consumer prices stubbornly refuse to drop, that is the literal textbook definition of the stagflation monster arriving.
And finally, indicator number 5, the strength of the U.S. dollar. Watch for persistent long-term dollar weakness on the foreign exchange markets, especially amidst these coordinated BRICS de-dollarization efforts.
A structurally weak dollar mathematically guarantees that everything we import from electronics to vehicles to raw materials becomes instantly more expensive, importing a massive wave of inflation directly into the domestic U.S. economy.
Why do I want you obsessively checking these 5 things? Because this macroeconomic dashboard dictates the reality of your daily life.
If stagflation fully materializes, the cash sitting in your traditional savings account evaporates in purchasing power. Fixed income bonds get absolutely destroyed.
You will have to radically pivot how you invest your retirement, what kind of fixed-rate debt you are willing to carry, and how aggressively you negotiate your salary just to tread water. You need this dashboard to survive the storm.
If we pull all the way back and look at the sweeping 1700-year timeline we have covered today, the ultimate macroeconomic lesson from history is perfectly, starkly clear. Stagflation is never an unpredictable act of God. It doesn't just spontaneously descend from the sky like a hurricane.
From the clipped, worthless copper coins of Emperor Diocletian to the massive guns and butter deficit spending of the 1960s, stagflation is systematically, deliberately engineered by human beings.
It is built layer by layer through long-term monetary indiscipline, cowardly political pressure applied to central banks, and a hubristic, arrogant refusal by leaders to acknowledge the real-world constraints of physical supply.
And that leaves us with a final chilling idea for you to mull over long after you finish listening today. Paul Volcker miraculously managed to defeat the stagflation monster in the 1980s by relying on the ultimate, unassailable institutional authority of the Federal Reserve.
He possessed the personal gravitas and the unshakable institutional credibility required to force an entire nation to swallow unimaginably bitter economic medicine.
But look honestly at our world today, in the late 2020s. Look at the deep, systemic fracturing of trust in experts, in government, and in the media.
If the exact same economic monster fully rears its head tomorrow, do our modern institutions still possess the deep reservoir of public trust and the sheer, suicidal political courage required to administer that brutal cure?
Or are we doomed to repeat the crisis of the 3rd century?
It is, without exaggeration, the defining economic question of our time.
Thank you so much for exploring these incredible historical sources with us today on EHP. Keep a very close eye on that dashboard, protect your purchasing power, stay endlessly curious, and we will see you on the next deep dive.